And Francisca, I wonder if you can also talk a bit about how the cases that you have dealt with have amplified that particular notion, that particular idea of self-respect and dignity. Francisca, let's start with you if we can. Is she with us?
Yes, Frank, I'm here. Okay, so in the course of our work, we've been able to identify victims of sextortion. Frank, can you hear me?
Yes, okay, go ahead.
Okay. So in the course of our work, we've been able to identify victims of sextortion, and we've been able to raise awareness about sextortion and also let these victims know that there are platforms like ours where they can come and report, and we can help them find solutions to such problems. So some of these victims have had to give in because they had no other alternative, and they did that not because they wanted to do it, but because they were pushed to the wall. So you find out that after some time, they lose their self-esteem. A victim has even spoken to us from one of the universities in Nigeria, and she said after doing the act, she felt like committing suicide because she couldn't bear to live with herself, because she felt like, oh well, I've been objectivized, my dignity had been reduced, so she felt like committing suicide. But for her encounter with us, we're able to let her know that that's not the end of the world. If she could speak out, it would prevent other people from being sextorted by such professors and lecturers. So yes, there's a very important need for awareness to be raised about sextortion, especially in Nigeria, because many youths don't even know that sextortion is even a problem, and they don't know how severe its consequences can be. So when we raise awareness about sextortion and let the students know about what they can do when they come into contact with such scenarios, we help them. And then also there needs to be strong policies put in place by the universities. Each university has their policy, but policies about sextortion, policies about lecturers or professors demanding sexual favors from students are not usually emphasized during orientations. So we teach the students what they need to do in such cases, since the universities don't do this. But then we also push that the universities during orientation of freshmen actually talk about these things, just to reassure the students that whenever they have problems, there are actually platforms or systems they can run to actually get respite. Also, we also need to support systems that have been established, independent systems like ours, that are helping to give the students a place to run to, sort of like a safe house. So international organizations like Transparency International, UNA-NCA also need to support institutions that are trying to give these victims a place to run to, sort of like creating a safe space for them, a safe public space where they can come and talk about what they have experienced. Those who are actually being approached by such professors can talk about it, and then together in the team we can prefer solutions and say, okay, don't give in. This is what you can do. These are the people we can talk to in the authority and all that. And then by the time we do all this and help these victims, we're sure that people will speak up better when they are actually sextorted or when they're in the process of being asked for sex. Because students most times in Nigeria are very interested in graduating at the appointed time when you're supposed to graduate. And this is because not graduating when you're supposed to graduate has a lot of implications. It has financial implications. If your course was supposed to be a 4-year course and you had to graduate at the end of 5 years, that's like you have to pay extra tuition for 1 year. And most of the students are not even from wealthy homes. So it brings up that economic implication. It also affects the psyche of the students and all that. So a lot of work needs to be done to ensure that, first of all, people understand that sextortion is an issue, and then together we all work to ensure that when professors actually sextort students, they get sanctioned for it, they get punished for it. In some universities, like in the University of Lagos, after Kiki did her documentary, the lecturer was actually suspended. He was asked to leave at the end of everything. So if other institutions, other Nigerian universities around the world can actually take solid, concrete measures to punish perpetrators of these evil acts, then it will improve trust and it will improve believability in the system that actually when victims are sextorted, the oppressors get punished for it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. You've taken us, and Nancy has taken us, and Dina did a little bit before, already into the solutions. I think your point about safe places is one we want to unpack a bit more later. But I'd also like to, at this point, interject a question from somebody in our audience who is asking if our panelists could share some best practices for tackling sextortion. We just heard a bit from Nigeria in that vein. Otran, how about when you look at refugees and migration, do women who are so exposed, exploited by the abuse of power, do they have some means of dealing with this, of maintaining their self-respect, of finding a safe place? I wonder if you could talk about it within the refugee migration context. And what is best practice to answer the question?
I would say we found very little, unfortunately. What we did find is that there's luckily more focus now, at least once migrants arrive somewhere, you know, in a camp or in Europe, or that there are more organizations who tackle it from a sexual violence perspective, right? And who provide services. Because I think one thing that we need to take into consideration as well, it's not obviously dignity and self-respect, but it's also about health risks, right? So many of these women who have been sextorted have unwanted pregnancies, STDs, psychological trauma, all these things that are not usually discussed in connection with corruption. And we found that many organizations who work, you know, to protect, to provide shelter and support for victims of sexual violence, then also cover the sextortion victims, of course. What I found especially interesting there is that when we interviewed also, you know, women's shelters or refugees that were working with refugees and migrants, we found a lot of resistance to sextortion. So they were saying, no, by putting it with the corruption angle, you're trying to take away from the kind of harm that has been done with sexual violence. And I think us as kind of people who focus on the corruption perspective need to do much more work in explaining why it is important to also look at it from a corruption perspective, and that we're not trying to kind of take away from the importance of looking at it also from a sexual violence perspective. So I think that's somewhere where we need to work much closer together with organizations working on sexual violence, and to explain why this intersection is so important to tackle from both sides, right? From a corruption and a sexual violence perspective. And yeah, I think it was mostly those organizations who helped women kind of overcome the trauma. But what we found for all women that we talked to was that they were saying, well, there's no point in reporting this. You know, by the time I found out that it wasn't okay, I was already 2 countries further along on my journey. Or how could I report it to the police when the police were the one that were sextorting me? So we didn't really come across best practices kind of along the migration route. And in addition, we found that the organizations that are working with these women oftentimes were very reluctant to look at the sextortion angle. And maybe just to add one point, I think we also need to remember that it's different women that are, or different groups that are particularly vulnerable to this. And what we saw was particularly also LGBTQ community members, but also women with disabilities, or that women who were traveling with small children who were particularly exposed to be sextorted. So also to kind of dissect a bit more that while it happens everywhere and all women are at a risk, there are some women who are even more at risk.
Yeah, I think that's quite amazing. I wonder, Dina, now in the US perspective, very quickly, very quickly, very sharply, give us the 2 quick best practices to answer our questioner.
Best practices.
How do you find a safe place for, as you call them, your clients?
Yes. I think the first one is to get as much training on being trauma informed as you possibly can if you're interacting with individuals who have been sextorted. So really understanding where they're coming from, why things are happening, and doing those things. And the second thing is, because I'm a lawyer, I don't give social work or social services. And so what I always like to do is make sure that they are connected to a social service provider, because I can only tackle their legal problems. But at the end of the day, maybe we can get a victory in the courts, but I know, and they know, that that's not going to fully heal them, that there has been so much trauma that there are other steps that need to be taken. So it's recognizing our own limitations and what we can do, and making sure that they are getting holistic representations and services throughout. And I know this isn't quick, but I just want to give a quick client example. I had a client who, in return for custody of her children, the father, he said he would give custody for sex. And so for her, the focus was that she was a bad mother because he actually ended up not getting custody, and it was a long battle. And so, yes, maybe we could get custody for her children, but I'm not going to be able to tackle the issue of her thinking that she was a failure of a mother. And so it's recognizing our own limitations when we come to these issues, and making sure that our clients or these individuals feel completely supported and have those wraparound services that they need.
Yeah, I see some common threads. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. I'm thinking of what Indira was saying about India, that it really is sort of universal. And I'm just going to spike this a bit with another question to you, Marie. Marie, you and your research team in Berlin at Transparency International have recently done some amazing work on trying to study the impact on corruption and increasing corruption of the COVID-19 crisis. And we have a question about whether you, the experts, think that this problem of sextortion is likely to get even bigger as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. Marie, let's kick us off on that one.
That's a very difficult question, and I don't have a crystal ball. But one thing is for sure is that the COVID-19 has an impact on gender. I mean, mothers had to stay home to take care of the children and school them. Sometimes they lost their job. I mean, with the economic crisis which is coming, it's likely that many people will lose their job, including the most vulnerable, which are women, and tend to have more precarious jobs. So it is likely that the COVID crisis could step us back from the advances in gender equality that we've done in 10 years, or in decades. So, of course, since corruption is about abuse of power, I mean, we can take from that maybe women will be more exposed to other forms of corruption and might be more affected. But yeah, but your guess is as good as mine, I would suppose.
I would say. I mean, what you're saying in a way is that women are likely to be even more vulnerable.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, because they will be put in they will lose out from economic perspective, economic opportunities, and yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get back a little bit again to tackling best practices. Nancy, you've seen this in so many parts of the world. What really works to safeguard vulnerable women?
Oh, such a challenge, because there are so many different elements of this. And at the end of the day, you know, we won't end up ending impunity for this until we have tackled each of those elements. But one of the things that I do think is a best practice, IAWJ and TI have been collaborating for several years on a project in Morocco. And that bringing the anti-corruption community and the sort of women's rights community together over an issue that implicates both agendas and is cross-cutting in terms of all of our, you know, sustainable development goals. There's a lot of evidence that corruption exacerbates gender inequality, and gender inequality makes people more vulnerable to corruption. And both of them have long-term implications for our, you know, democratic governance and economic prosperity and peace, security, stability in the world. Not to say, you know, human rights, of course. So these are things that, as people were talking about earlier, each side brings a particular strength and perspective to. And when you look at it from only one of those perspectives, you miss a great deal about what is important about tackling the problem. And in Morocco, for example, we've been working with Transparency Morocco, and they in turn with local organizations that receive complaints from women. You know, working with those whom women already go to when they are victims of domestic violence and have other problems. They feel comfortable sharing their experiences and trust that this will be a safe place for them. We had started out thinking we could make the anti-corruption reporter centers more gender sensitive. That is still an admirable and important goal, but changing the existing behavior is much harder than actually working with what are the established reporting mechanisms. And so, you know, that experience and the success we have had has really confirmed for me the value of bringing these two communities together. Another simply,
you know, if I may, Nancy, I mean, you just said something very, I don't want to lose a point you just made. You talked about changing behavior. And we have a couple of questions. One says, you know, is this all cultural? And the culture issue that I often think about is there are cultures where women dare not report because even their families would turn against them. So there's that culture. But on the positive side, can we change culture here? And another question comes, is there any examples of where this issue is ever taught in schools, in high schools, middle schools, before all of this exposure? And I know that there have been quite a number of different projects done by different organizations on gender education for school children in many places. I don't know if it's included this. And I wonder if you know of anything, or whether any of our other experts here could answer those questions about behavior, about changing culture in a positive way, about school education. Maybe you want to very briefly start, Nancy, and then we'll go through everybody, because...
Yeah, no, I mean, ultimately, it is about changing culture. I know the women judges in Argentina were looking to do a program on bullying and sextortion in high schools to begin with, you know, people when they are younger, to help to shape attitudes. I know that the judges in Tanzania saw sextortion in the educational system as being such an important issue for the well-being of their society that they did presentations in local teachers' colleges, in secondary schools, talking about this issue and trying to make people aware. And people talked earlier about the fact that often people don't know that this is wrong. They feel shame, they assume they consented in some way. The public education materials they receive may talk about bribes in totally financial terms. They may not have any concept that this is equally inappropriate. And I sometimes wonder whether some of the people who engage in sextortion, some of them also demand financial bribes, but I think some of them don't. I don't think they see their conduct as corrupt in the same way and as damaging to their society in the same way. They see it as a personal perk.
Yeah, that takes us directly back to Indira. And Indira, I wonder if you jump in here, because we have a question about the comment about being a patriarchal society. And I remember in Otra Merkel's wonderful study that she basically blamed the fact that too many of these systems are male-dominated, male-directed, and that's why we're not paying enough attention to this. How, Indira, to pick you up on patriarchal society, how do we change awareness, at least? I'm not saying change the Indian culture, but how do we change the awareness and the sensitivity to this within the Indian context?
We all know that, as you all said, culture has an impact, a huge impact. And we all know it's a patriarchal society in India. And so what do we do about it? It's going to take a long time for it to change. But I think in the meantime, we have to work both top down as well as from the grassroots. The top down would be to make sure that the legal aspect of it is in place. And both in India, we have both the GBV laws now, apparently, I'm told, is very good. And also the Prevention of Corruption Act in 2018 was amended to include bribery and corruption, not only the transfer of money and power, but also to cover sextortion. But that amendment has caused problems because it criminalizes both the giver and who takes the bribe. So where we go is the top down, we have to make sure that that is in position. And I mean, what I'm told is that a simple equation of sextortion with monetary bribes is inappropriate. That's where the cultural aspect of this to come in. How will any woman report this if she has to report within 7 days? And she also needs to, it's sanctioned by an authority. She's afraid of authority. So I think the top down, when you make these wonderful laws, you have to be conscious of the culture of the country. But at the bottom down, that's what we work in PTF at the grassroots. I think that idea of working with existing groups will help. India has these wonderful self-help groups. And apparently, whenever I have visited India, they play an incredible role. Maybe we need to train them to be able to get to talk to the local people, to their community, and probably help them there. But changing the culture, it will change. It is changing in India. It is changing in urban India. But in rural India, it's going to take a little more time. We need people with icons, Bollywood icons. Bollywood is a big thing in India. Maybe we can recruit them to help us. And in fact, there's some of these sitcoms will help in maybe introduce this element of it in sitcoms, because sitcoms are watched, especially now that most people are at home, they do watch a lot of that. And generally it has to be both top down and bottom up with the media. And India has a very vibrant media. Use it. Let's use the media for this. And that's, under the circumstances, I think it's the best that we can do. India is a very old civilization, so some of these things are ingrained, but it has changed considerably. So I have great hopes that it is going to change. And in India, it's the kind of thing, it changes suddenly. I mean, it looks as if nothing's going to change, and suddenly it changes. So let's hope that this is one of this that can change quite quickly.
Yeah, I must say, I think, you know, I take that last point. I'm very encouraged by it. It's really good that we get some optimism here, because otherwise we'd be too depressed. And in that context, I'm delighted that Delia Ferreira-Rubio has joined us, because she points out, she thanks you, Nancy, for mentioning Argentina. Delia, who is the chair of the TI International Board and is Argentinian, points out that there has been a major effort by judges and leading people to raise this issue and in schools in Argentina. Marie, I found in a lot of research quite some years ago that the TI advisory centers, so-called AWACS, be it in Lebanon, be it in Bosnia, be it in several other countries, were opportunities for women to come in and complain about these things, knowing that they could get a degree of anonymity, that they could be shielded, that they could be kept safe. We come back to the term safe places that was used earlier in our discussion, and report out. Do you find that this kind of grassroots legal advocacy type of centers can play a constructive role in providing safe places, but at the same time bringing the criminals, let's call them that, exposing them, bringing them to some sort of justice?
Definitely. I mean, you were speaking about good practice. I mean, when you think about whistleblowing and reporting mechanism, you need to understand what are the barriers, and what some are linked to the nature of the offense, because it's also so taboo, and so. But some is linked as well to the reporting mechanism that we offer or not. You know, women need to be aware that they exist, how to report. They need to have the time and money to engage with the reporting process. They need to trust the reporting mechanism. They need to have the perception that if they complain, something will happen. And there is some evidence which says that when women report, sometimes they are more often dismissed the case, you know. There is availability and access. And there is as well the issue of gender sensitive awareness, in the sense that women, and in some culture actually, a woman wouldn't report to a man, but talking about these very specific problems, I mean, it's important that they have the opportunity, if they wish, to be able to report to a woman. So our chapters, I mean, we have a couple of chapters who are actually tackling sextortion through the ELACs. Some of them try to make sure that it's accessible, and that women can report anonymously as well, because it makes them safer. So you can do that with hotlines. For example, I mean, I know that TI Venezuela has an operator hotline, but as well an app that can be used by women anonymously, and they can track where the case is and all that. And TI Sri Lanka, for example, or TI Zimbabwe, or even TI Ghana, they have set up some mobile units, mobile ALACs, because I mean, one of the barriers to reporting is as well to reach the reporting mechanism when it's in big cities, when there is a time as well to get there. So in these countries, they've organized this mobile ALACs with good results. So yes, I mean, definitely the TI ALACs is a good way, or a good channel for that. But I mean, I fully support what Nancy was saying as well about the experience in TI Morocco, and how to partner with women's organizations, which sometimes are more established, you know, and since sextortion is relatively new as a concept, as a form of corruption, women may not have the knowledge and awareness that corruption reporting mechanism can tackle as well this form of corruption. So I think what's very important in this sense is that there is a very strong collaboration between the various mechanisms, because at the end of the day, we want women to empower women to report wherever, I mean, whatever the channel.
Well, you know, reporting mechanisms is really interesting. Otran, from your experience, is the European Union or any of its particular branches actually focusing on the issues that you're talking about with migration and refugees? We are here, this is a discussion with the United Nations Association. You're at the UN University in the Netherlands. Is the UN actually putting this onto some sort of priority list? In other words, I'd like to get into a bit of the discussion about what multilateral institutions or official institutions can actually do, because I think until they really embrace this, we're not going to get sufficient traction. I may be wrong, so I'd love for you to kick that off.
I would say the short answer is no. I don't see anyone putting this, top and center, particularly not within the migration and refugee debate. I would say, also going back to your question about COVID that was asked in the beginning, we're also going to see that this gets worse, right? Because borders are closing, economic crisis leads to even more borders closing. So I don't see a particular focus on this. And this is in general, that there's also not a particular focus on violence against migrants, right? So we see lots of reports coming out of Libya where there's horrendous violence against men and women. We see it in the newspaper, we say, oh, this is awful, and it kind of disappears again, right? And I think this is with sextortion the same. I think one thing that is important there, and would also help the debate when we talk about migrants, is to also highlight more how prevalent this is also in European countries, right? This is not something that migrants only experience en route, but they also experience it once they arrive in Europe. It's also what women in Europe experience, right? And to focus more on that and then kind of get the ball rolling, I think would be a good strategy.
Yeah, I mean, Dina, do you find that at any really powerful official center, you're getting a sensitivity to this? I mean, we've heard from Indira how she believes a lot is going to happen from the grassroots up, and I think that's always important, but are you getting real allies at the top as well? Or is this still somehow or other off the priority list?
I think that it is not exactly on the priority list, and it's kind of like Indira was saying, when it does come up, it's kind of handled incorrectly. So you kind of had that criminalization of the person who was being coerced, and you're like, wait, what's going on here? So I think we see similar things, that because legislators and kind of from the top, people aren't putting survivors at the forefront and talking to them and asking them about their experiences and saying, what would have aided you? What laws would have helped you? Can you tell us what to legislate or what to do? We're creating laws that are actually either harmful or just don't work. And that's kind of, I want to say, in the best case scenario, when people are even talking about this. But no, to answer your question.
Well, I mean, does the emergence of the Me Too movement as a whole provide you with an opportunity to really raise this?
I think that Me Too in and of itself is a really wonderful movement, but I think it is a specific movement for individuals who are empowered enough to say Me Too. I think that we need to start from the bottom and recognize that for a lot of people, coming forward is hard. And so we have these celebrities and these actresses and these rich white women coming forward, and we don't recognize, well, what about the woman who works in a hotel, who doesn't have the support system, who doesn't have access to the same things that that these privileged women have, and so we're forgetting about them. And I think that's a really necessary thing for us to look into. So recognizing that the Me Too movement has started this conversation, how do we bring it down to a level where Me Too is for everyone who is who has felt this. And that's anyone who's in a marginalized community, whether it's the LGBTQIA community, whether it's migrants, and the intersectionality of all of who they are and how that affects their access to justice as well.
I wonder just quickly, Francesca, there's been this amazing BBC documentary done by Nigerians, Undercover, that really exposed sextortion as it really happens on campuses, university campuses in Nigeria. Has that triggered a public debate at the government level in Nigeria at all?
Okay, so after the documentary was done by BBC Africa Eye, exposing sextortion in Nigerian universities and in Africa, some government officials came up on social media to kick against it and to say that sextortion wasn't a good thing, and they stood firmly against it. But sextortion hasn't been brought into mainstream discussion yet, to my knowledge, in Nigeria. It hasn't really been seen as a very major form of corruption in Nigerian universities. So there's actually a need for sextortion to be spoken about in mainstream discussions about the various problems that are plaguing students in Nigerian universities. Just to answer some of the questions you asked earlier, Nigeria is a largely religious society. So in addition to our leaders speaking up about sextortion and the dangers of it, how bad it is, I believe that religious leaders who are actually spread around both the rural communities, the urban communities of Nigeria, actually have a very important role to play to talk about sextortion. And because Nigeria is largely religious, people actually listen to their religious leaders. Also, Nigeria is a patriarchal society. So when good men who actually believe, good men like Frank, who believe that sextortion is actually it's actually criminal, if I would use that word, come together to actually support women who are victims of sextortion, it goes a long way. Because let me give you an instance. There was a student who told me her experience. Okay, she was an A student. She had been passing all the while from her first year to her final year. And in the second semester of her final year, a lecturer deliberately failed her because he had demanded for sex, and she refused to offer it. So what saved her was other good-spirited professors who actually noticed and said, this student had been having a track record of good results. So what's happening now? And in their own good nature, they went ahead to actually find out what the problem was. And that was when they discovered that this student was actually, the professor was trying to sextort the student, and because she said no, he actually failed her. So a lot needs to be done by each and every one of us. The Nigerian government would have to bring sextortion into mainstream discussion because it's a big issue, especially in our educational system, because students need to have faith in the educational system. We don't want young ladies going into the university, and from the first start of the university, they already have it in their mind that, I'm going to be sitting at the back of the class so that no lecturer can notice me, so that no lecturer can actually ask me for sex, you know? These are very legitimate issues that are actually going on in our society. So yeah, thank you, Frank.
Thank you. Well, we're coming to a close, so I'd like to go to each of the others here with a very quick comment. Where do we go from here? Very, very quickly. 30 seconds, a minute each. Why don't we start with you, Marie? Where are we going from here? Where do we take this whole discussion and lead to success, or the optimism that Indira was sharing with us?
Okay, I mean, in my opinion, there are three directions that we should go. I mean, first, data for understanding the phenomenon, for advocacy, but in my opinion, most importantly, to have the voice of all these women and men as well, some men are as well sextorted, heard, because it has been so long invisible and a silent form of corruption. So that data. The second one is, of course, fighting impunity, making sure that perpetrators are adequately punished. So with adequate legal frameworks, here as well a little bit of research to be done. And third, of course, support to victims, you know, and empowerment and providing them with safe place to report and the resources that they need in terms of legal resources, psychological, health, financial as well, because it has a cost. So, I mean, in my opinion, that's the three main set of recommendations that I would make.
Well, that's so brief and that's so excellent. Nancy, match that. Where do we go? How do we take it up? Very briefly, please.
Well, I think Marie has laid out the path in an excellent way. And I just wanted to say, you know, I vacillate between a very dark view of how will we ever change these deeply entrenched patriarchal attitudes that allow this to continue with impunity, and optimism. You know, 5 years ago, when I first met Frank at the IACC in Malaysia, people weren't talking about this. I was doing a session on it. I had two recommendations. One was we needed to collect data about it. And the second was we needed to begin changing institutional cultures with codes of conduct. At the time, people said, lots of luck getting this into our surveys. You know, it costs a lot of money to add questions. And lo and behold, today, Transparency is collecting this information. That's fabulous. That is real progress. UNODC, its Global Judicial Integrity Network, is looking at how to incorporate issues like sextortion into the international principles that guide judicial conduct. The IBA, International Bar Association, has come out with a study saying that the current legal
Nancy, I'm sorry, cutting you off. We're really running out of time.
Okay.
One big thing we have to do next.
I think that really we just need to keep talking about it. We need to keep focusing on it. It needs to be part of our mindset, and it hasn't been, and it's encouraging that it is now reaching all of these places. So that's the optimistic part.
Okay, well, that's good. Orchard.
Can
you add?
I agree with everything that has been said, but I also would say building alliances, right? Trying to find allies in the women's movement and in, you know, going beyond the anti-corruption crowd and trying to really find allies in the fight against sextortion is a big step as well.
Well, I think we've already got some alliances here and some allies here. Dina, what's the one big step we have to do next?
I think it's putting survivors in leadership positions and allowing them to not only tell their story, but allow them to lead the narrative into what we should be doing to change laws and to change mindsets.
Indira?
To get data, as Marie said, to understand the nuances, work both top down, have good implementable laws, bottom down, bottom up, which is grassroots. We have to work at the grassroots if we want to work in the rural areas, and we need to persist and push this issue out into the open.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'd like to thank our audience. I'd just like to make a couple of concluding comments, if I may. First of all, we will put up a lot of information about information from our experts and information we received from others if they want to send it to us on ptfund.org. And we will put up on the website resources so that people can further engage on the issue of sextortion. PTF over the years has done a lot of projects in health and education. Almost all of them have a very strong gender component. We will be doing more. We will be more sensitive than ever to this sextortion issue, and we hope that many others in the same type of space will be as well. I really want to thank Paula Boland, who introduced today's discussion, and Shana, who moderated the first half, Ed Elmendorf as well from UNA-NCA, Stephen Mosley, the chair of the board. It's been a wonderful partnership with UNA-NCA. I want to thank my colleagues, of course, in the Partnership for Transparency Fund, Indira, of course, Pietronella Van Ovre, Richard Stern, and others who have worked very hard behind the scenes to make today's event come across. Finally, I want to thank our panelists once more. We see this as just another step towards increasing public awareness and public understanding of this incredibly important issue that, as Autran said, just isn't getting traction at the highest multilateral levels. We need to put it on that agenda. At the national level, at the local level here in DC, Dina, I will support you anywhere we can, but also at the international level, because tens of millions of victims throughout the year, mostly women, are suffering this horrendous form of corruption, this abuse of power. And the world is not paying sufficient attention. So let me quote just one of the comments we had in our chat room in conclusion, where one of the people said, it's necessary to accentuate and reinforce the work on sextortion. I said, absolutely, let's go ahead, let's do more, and let's build alliances so that we can really see positive results. With that, I'd like to thank everybody who's participated, and especially thank our audience. We'll be holding more events. Send us your suggestions for more events. And please, in your own circles, in your own networks, share so many of the wonderful words of wisdom that we've heard from our experts today. With that, thank you very much, everybody, and all the very best. Goodbye.